The restructuring call began at 9 a.m. Eastern. My father chaired it from the head of the conference table in Chicago. The acquiring firm joined by video. Outside counsel dialed in. My name appeared on the agenda under Leadership Transition. No one asked me to speak. We're consolidating executive oversight, my father said, hands folded neatly over the printed term sheet. Given the acquisition structure, it makes sense for operations to roll upward. The buyer's representative nodded. Continuity will be managed internally. Internally meant not me. My mother, who held the largest block of voting shares through the family trust, added, "Of course, we're grateful for the foundational work. But at this stage, institutional leadership is required." Foundational work. They discussed me as if I were a vendor contract approaching expiration. Her transition period will be brief, outside counsel confirmed. All core assets are included in the purchase. All core assets. No one looked in my direction when the formal vote was recorded. The motion passed unanimously. My removal was documented in bullet points. I did not interrupt. I watched the screen where my own company, my architecture, my operating model, my properties, was summarized into valuation metrics and risk disclosures. The meeting ended on schedule. Clarity is rarely loud. It usually arrives in well-formatted PDFs. Professional erasure is rarely dramatic. It is procedural. When you are removed from something you built, do you react immediately, or do you wait to see what exactly was transferred? If you have ever watched control shift in a room where your name built the foundation, you understand how quiet that moment can feel. I remained quiet because noise would have complicated the paperwork. The hotel group began 5 years earlier as a single renovation project. I sourced the property. I negotiated the distressed asset purchase. I designed the boutique operating model that would later scale. My parents provided initial capital. The arrangement was simple and, in retrospect, imprecise. They funded the first acquisition through a family investment vehicle. I handled development, branding, systems, and operations. Ownership was divided according to capital contribution rather than intellectual contribution. We did not formalize governance beyond standard incorporation templates. Board meetings were informal. Voting was assumed rather than documented in advance. We relied on trust. Revenue growth was rapid. Within 3 years, we expanded from 1 property to 6 across 3 cities. Press coverage described it as a modern hospitality success story. Internally, it remained a family structure with corporate revenue. Majority shares sat inside the family trust. I retained a minority equity position but full operational authority under my executive title. The assumption, shared by everyone, was that authority followed majority ownership. It usually does. The buyers who approached us were interested in portfolio acquisition. They wanted the brand, the occupancy metrics, the expansion pipeline, and the data model we used for dynamic pricing. Due diligence focused heavily on financial performance. Very little time was spent examining system authorship. My father negotiated valuation based on revenue multiples. He spoke confidently about seamless integration. We had never clarified what precisely was owned by the corporation versus licensed to it. That ambiguity did not seem relevant while we were aligned. It became central the moment alignment ended. Overconfidence is common in majority positions. When you hold more than 50% of voting shares, it is easy to assume you hold everything else. Ownership, however, is layered. Equity is one layer. Infrastructure is another. From the beginning, I built the operational backbone myself. Our hotels did not rely on off-the-shelf property management software alone. I architected a proprietary system that integrated reservations, dynamic pricing, vendor logistics, staffing ratios, predictive maintenance scheduling, and guest personalization data. It was modular. It was centralized. And it was designed under my authority. The build pipeline was registered under my developer credentials. The primary repository administrator was me. Security certificates were issued through an account I personally controlled. None of this was hidden. It simply was not examined. Within the company, I was treated as the technical founder. The assumption was that systems could be reassigned like staff roles. Buyers often believe integration is procedural. Transfer credentials. Assign a new CTO. Continue operations. In hospitality, what matters most appears visible. Rooms, staff, occupancy, guest satisfaction. The invisible layer. How pricing updates across properties in real time, how maintenance triggers before failure, how data flows between booking engines and financial forecasts, is rarely discussed in boardrooms. I did not correct their assumptions. The acquisition model presented by the buyers described full operational continuity. Continuity depends on access. Access depends on rights. Those rights were not identical to equity shares. But no one asked for clarification. I could have raised questions during the restructuring call. I could have requested technical carve-outs or insisted on extended transition terms. Doing so would have delayed the closing. Delay introduces scrutiny. Scrutiny invites renegotiation. Renegotiation weakens clarity. Silence preserves documentation. People confuse access with ownership. Access can be granted temporarily. Ownership is defined by contract. The incorporation documents drafted in our first year contained language most founders overlook. I did not. The core platform had been developed under a separate holding entity I established before incorporation. The operating company was granted a perpetual but conditional license. Conditional does not mean fragile. It means defined. Had I argued emotionally, the structure might have been amended. By remaining silent, I allowed the existing documents to stand unmodified. Transactions move quickly when no one objects. I had no objection to the sale. I only had clarity about what it included. The deal closed 6 weeks later. Press releases described it as a strategic expansion. My father appeared in business media interviews discussing generational entrepreneurship. An internal email circulated announcing my departure as part of organizational evolution. I responded professionally. I transferred day-to-day operational credentials associated with the corporate email domain. I signed exit documents confirming termination of my executive role. I attended a final transition meeting with the acquiring firm's integration team. They asked practical questions about vendor relationships, staffing models, and branding guidelines. I answered clearly. No one asked about repository ownership. No one asked about licensing conditions embedded in the software layer. The closing binder listed assets conveyed: physical properties, trademarks, domain names, equipment leases, goodwill. The intellectual property schedule referenced operational software utilized by the company. Utilized, not assigned. I archived my internal communications and removed my personal authentication keys from shared machines. There was no sabotage. There was no disruption. Rooms remained booked. Guests checked in. Revenue flowed. From the outside, continuity appeared intact. Celebratory dinner photos were posted online. My father thanked investors publicly. He did not contact me privately. He did not need to. The paperwork had already spoken. The platform architecture consisted of several layers. At the surface level, each property used standard reservation interfaces connected to global booking engines. Beneath that layer sat our proprietary revenue engine. It processed occupancy data, local event signals, competitor pricing, and historical trends to update rates automatically across all properties every 12 minutes. That engine was not sold. It was licensed. The license agreement, drafted during incorporation, granted the operating company rights to use the system for as long as certain conditions were met, including continuity of the original executive oversight structure. Executive oversight no longer included me. The source repository was administered through my holding entity. Administrative control allowed me to issue or revoke deployment certificates. An encrypted license file authenticated each property's access to the revenue engine. The file was generated annually. It had been generated by me every year since inception. The authentication key tied the operating environment to the licensed entity. Without renewal, the system did not crash. It simply reverted to manual pricing logic. Manual pricing in a multi-city boutique portfolio reduces margin predictability by measurable percentages. Maintenance scheduling relied on predictive algorithms housed in the same system. Vendor payment forecasting synced with occupancy projections generated by that engine. Remove the license, and the visible hotel still functions. What changes is efficiency. What changes is valuation stability. Dependency is rarely visible in photographs of renovated lobbies. It exists in back-end permissions. When the acquisition closed, the annual license renewal date was 3 months away. No one mentioned it during transition. No one asked who generated the encrypted file. I did not volunteer the information. Ownership documents were clear. The platform remained mine. 2 months after closing, the acquiring firm initiated a portfolio-wide feature rollout. They planned to integrate a third-party loyalty platform and expand into 2 additional cities. Scaling requires rate recalibration and database synchronization. The first anomalies appeared in internal reporting dashboards. Rate updates lagged. Event-based surge adjustments failed to trigger automatically. Finance teams noticed margin compression compared to forecast models used during acquisition. An attempt was made to modify the pricing algorithm directly. Access permissions prevented deployment. The encrypted license file flagged expiration warnings in system logs. IT teams treated it as a minor configuration issue. They requested updated credentials. Corporate email accounts linked to my former role no longer functioned. Without administrative access, certain modules defaulted to baseline logic. Nothing collapsed. Nothing crashed publicly. Guests continued booking rooms. But integration slowed. Expansion projections were paused pending technical clarification. Systems behave according to authorization boundaries. They do not respond to press releases. When their legal team contacted me, the tone was procedural. They requested confirmation that all intellectual property had transferred at closing. I responded with documentation. The asset purchase agreement conveyed trademarks, domains, physical assets, and goodwill. The software platform was referenced as licensed under pre-existing agreements. The incorporation documents, signed by all founding shareholders, identified my holding entity as sole owner of the core system. The operating company held a conditional perpetual license. Conditional upon governance continuity. Governance continuity had changed. Therefore, license renewal required authorization from the owning entity, which was mine. I did not threaten. I did not demand. I clarified. They own the hotels. They own the brand. They did not own the engine optimizing both. Authorization was available under standard licensing terms. Standard terms were not discounted. Lawyers prefer documentation to emotion. Within days, the acquiring firm requested full copies of our original incorporation filings, shareholder agreements, and intellectual property schedules. Outside counsel compared those documents to the acquisition binder. Language matters in transactions. The phrase utilized by the company does not equal assignment. The license agreement referenced executive oversight structures that no longer existed post-restructuring. The renewal clause required written authorization from the owning entity each fiscal year. That entity was not part of the acquisition. My father's confidence during negotiation had relied on an assumption that because majority shares were held by the family trust, all operational assets were implicitly controlled. Implicit control does not override explicit documentation. Valuation models used during acquisition assumed full operational continuity under identical margin structures. Margin stability depended on algorithmic optimization. Without renewal, margins compressed. Projected expansion into 2 additional cities stalled. The acquiring firm's board requested clarification on risk exposure. Risk exposure alters financing terms. Financing terms alter strategic appetite. My parents were informed that certain representations made during negotiation might require amendment. Amendment discussions introduce reputational review. Reputational review slows future deals. I was not present for those conversations. I received a formal inquiry requesting discussion of mutually beneficial alignment. Alignment had existed previously. It had been restructured. The realization was not dramatic. It unfolded through marked-up PDFs and scheduled conference calls. Dependency became quantifiable. The acquiring firm recalculated projected EBITDA under manual pricing assumptions. The difference was significant. Not catastrophic. Significant. Significance in finance triggers caution. Caution shifts leverage. My father sent a brief message weeks later. Family dinner at 7 p.m. Bring the check. The message referenced a newspaper headline about my new venture. An independent hotel concept built under my holding entity, launched quietly during transition. Headlines change tone quickly when margins are clear. Dinner invitations often follow. I attended. I brought documentation. The meeting was held in a private room at a downtown restaurant. No raised voices. No accusations. My father described the situation as an oversight. Oversight is a neutral word. The acquiring firm proposed renegotiating the license under revised compensation. They suggested my return in an advisory capacity. I declined operational reentry. Licensing terms were outlined in writing. They reflected market value for proprietary revenue infrastructure across a multi-property portfolio. No discount was offered. No equity swap was proposed. Authorization would be granted upon execution of the revised agreement. Until then, existing license conditions remained unchanged. Professional separation requires boundaries that do not fluctuate with family dynamics. I left the restaurant before dessert. Founders are often told that vision is intangible. In reality, it is structural. Authorship is not defined by applause or titles. It is defined by documentation. Ownership is not implied by capital alone. It is allocated through agreements drafted at formation, often before growth attracts attention. I did not design the platform anticipating conflict. I designed it anticipating scale. Scale requires clarity. Clarity requires separation between entity and individual contributions. The acquisition continued under amended financial projections while negotiations proceeded. My independent hotel portfolio expanded under the same infrastructure model. Investors evaluating my new venture asked detailed questions about intellectual property ownership. I answered with organized documentation. There was no animosity in my explanations. There was no reference to prior restructuring. Markets respond to predictability. Predictability begins with clearly defined rights. I attended industry conferences months later, where former partners spoke on panels about integration challenges. I was not mentioned. That was appropriate. Systems do not require recognition. They require authorization. When people ask how I handled being removed from the company I built, I explain that removal is not erasure if authorship is documented correctly. Equity can shift. Titles can be reassigned. Press narratives can change within a news cycle. Contracts remain. The final licensing agreement was executed on standard commercial terms. Authorization was granted. The engine continued operating. I did not return. Control was never about presence. It was about structure. And structure, once defined, does not reverse itself for sentiment.